Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. This is the Hispanic Heritage Month event, the last one put on by the UCF Puerto Rico Research Hub. My name is Zoe Colon, and I am the Associate Director for Global Perspectives and International Initiatives, and also a proud Senior Advisor to the Puerto Rico Research Hub. I am excited to present this panel of Puertorriqueñas Poderosas de la Diaspora Puertorriqueña. I wanted to just give a chance to Dr. Rivera, who is the director of the hub, to say a few words and welcome us, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Zoe, and I'm very glad to have a wonderful panel today. And thank you for attending the event today. It's going to be a wonderful one. Make sure to follow us on our social media platforms so you know more about the stuff that we're doing. And I welcome you all. And with that, I'll turn it over to Zoe.
Welcome, welcome. So we have a group of friends and colleagues that I've been in contact with over the years that I admire tremendously. And I'm very honored and blessed to feel, to be part of this. I want to just get started by asking you to take turns introducing yourself briefly so we can start our questions. And so I wanted to ask Nancy to get started, please.
Sure, pick on the little one. My name is Nancy Rosado. I was born and raised in the South Bronx. A big part of my my education and so on and so forth was conducted by, if you could believe this one, Irish nuns. So it's been an interesting journey. But my parents were very, very dedicated people to our culture, and that's what kept me connected.
Maricel.
Good morning. I'm calling in from Arizona, so it's still morning here, but good afternoon, I guess, on the East Coast. Thank you, Zoe, for putting this event together and all the programming that you've done in honor of our rich heritage. My name is, again, Maricel Herrera. I was born and raised in Spanish Harlem in New York City. My parents are from Puerto Rico, from Camuy and Atillo, respectively. And I grew up in a really large family of 8. And I made my way through New York City and through to college and grad school and ended up in Arizona for the last 25 years. And I'm just really excited to be here.
Thank you. Raquel.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Raquel. I'm based in Orlando, but I feel like we have most of the boroughs covered here. I was born in Far Rockaway, Queens, New York. So yeah, I'm a journalist, currently the deputy director of Refinery 29 Somos. So a lot of my work centers on sharing the stories of Latinx folks, specifically Latina women and Latinx femmes.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Sorry, I was on mute. My name is Elizabeth. I was born and raised in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I am a writer. I'm a poet specifically. I write a lot based on my own experiences. I'm also a high school dropout. I used to not say that proudly, but I say that proudly now because I think it's important to talk about all of the ways in which we exist and resist in the diaspora. So I'm really excited to be here and I'm so excited to meet y'all. So.
Thank you. Fellow Boricua from the Bronx. I've been in Orlando for 6 years. And it's a very interesting experience to be part of the diaspora, but live in a different part of the country where we have more newly arrived folks from Puerto Rico, and just be able to learn from that experience, but also just embrace that richness of my culture again. I think by the time, I left New York, many of the cuchifritos had become taquerias, right? So there were other groups coming into places that had been historically Puerto Rican, and before that, maybe Italian. And so it's that trajectory, and I think it happens organically, and that's how it evolves. But then when I came to Orlando, I'm like, oh my God, I can get alcapurrias like any day of the week, right? Surullitos, Malta, whatever it is, like it was there. So I'm kind of like re-experiencing that. It's almost like I'm in Puerto Rico a lot of times. So I'm just excited to be here, and there's a lot of work to be done, and that's why the work that we do at UCF around Latino student success at the Puerto Rico Research Hub is so near and dear to my heart, because I think that this is the new epicenter of Boricuas, right? And so many of us are connected to Orlando if we don't live here. And that's for obvious reasons. We have a ton of families here. Alguien tiene un primo en Orlando en Kissimmee, right? So that's the connection. Obviously, I think Maricel, your mom lives here, or family members live here. Nancy, again, from New York and has lived here. How many years have you been here, Nancy?
It's been 14.
14. Yeah, and we met, doing some activism in the Puerto Rican community, right? So there's a lot of work to be done, but a lot of great things to highlight. And I wanted to highlight, poderosas like yourselves. And I want to start by asking, tell me some of the experiences that have shaped your identity and influenced your work. And we can get started. Let's start with Elizabeth.
Yeah, so the earliest memory I have, even before I started writing, was being in the Pentecostal church. And so I was around a bunch of other Puerto Rican Pentecostals. I am the first born in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Everybody else in my family was born in Puerto Rico. And so I remember very vividly the Puerto Rican culture was all around us, right? Even though I wasn't born in Puerto Rico, everybody made it very clear that we were Puerto Rican. And so I remember on Sundays, some of the church ladies would make food, right? And it was, arroz con andule, empanada, or pastelillo, because I didn't call it empanadas until very later on when I went to another restaurant. And I was like, dame un pastelillo de carne. And they were like, what are you talking about? That's pastelillo's a cake. And I was just like, well, the little thing, like I had to describe it, and they were like empanadas. That's when I realized that like we even had our own lexicon, but yeah, I remember sitting around eating food that I was being fed by these Puerto Rican ladies, and just thinking to myself like, yo, even God must be Puerto Rican. He gotta be Puerto Rican, because this is, and so that was also the time that I fell in love with language. I started writing because I found myself in my sister's diary, as opposed to finding Puerto Rican stories in the library, which didn't exist. But even prior to that, thinking about how much of my love for literature was influenced by the reverence that we had for scripture, so to speak, right? And it wasn't until later on that I really started to realize, like, that I could have that same reverence for my stories. And in a sense, like, being Puerto Rican was part of this like sacred community, this sacred holy thing. And so I started treating myself like that. And I started treating my work like that. And I started treating our stories as very sacred. And yeah, it was something very magical when I realized that I could start writing about us in a way that I hadn't seen exist before. So that's a little bit of how I came into my experiences as a writer.
Anyone else would like to share how their experiences have shaped their work?
Yeah, I'll jump into this. So like I said, I had a very heavy influence by Irish nuns who had very little patience for the little brown ones. And I think that made all the difference, right? I felt sorry for them to some extent, because here I had this culture that was so much fun, and I was like, could have been 6, 7 years old, and I realized that there was such a huge difference between how these people carried themselves and how they spoke, and how we did things. And they were trying to really jam their perspectives down our throats, but this commitment every year that my parents had to sending my brother and I to Puerto Rico, to keep us grounded, in touch with our culture, in touch with our language, in touch with the family roots. And it was so strong that I would come back with all sorts of things, like the first time I heard Versos Negroide, or the first time I saw Bomba. I came back with all this in my soul. you know, like they say, "Hasta en la luna," and you feel it. I was born in New York, and then I'm forever in that debate that I'm sure some of you have had to deal with, where, you know, are you a real Puerto Rican because you weren't born on the island? Pero cuando yo say, hablo español, ¿qué carajo? What's wrong with you guys? You know, that's the natural response in me. But it was always this attraction to this stuff has to be put on paper. This stuff, right? These experiences have to be documented before they go away. So I'm a more of a visual person. I do a lot of photography work, and these images that speak so loudly to us, it became really important to me, even as a child, to record them, and to keep them and to write notes about them, including how I felt when taking the pictures and what I was experiencing and what I was seeing. You know, and that has formed me all the way. One of the unusual aspects of my life, and one of the areas I've encountered a lot of problems with, my chosen occupation versus my profession. I'm a clinical social worker, but my occupation, I became a police officer. And again, a very heavy, when I joined years ago, very heavy Irish culture thing, which thanks to the nuns, I kind of understood and I could navigate. But it was the constant experiencing of how we were treated. Although we were also, you know, a minority within this group, minority on the outside, minority on the inside. There's always been this conflict where you're perceived as a traitor by the community sometimes. Um, and internally, you're sort of an outsider, you know, yeah, you're a brother or sister in blue, yeah, right. You know, otro perro con ese hueso. But those are realities, right? And you survive these things. So, you know, again, all things that merit documenting. These are experiences I think that people ignore or overlook or déjalo pasar, that sort of thing. So that really, all of these conflicts, and even moving to Puerto Rico to Florida that Zoe brought up. Um, I felt like I had gone back to, what am I, back in the 60s and 70s? And do I have to fight all over again? Because it's not New York. The diversity is there to some extent, but the people in charge are, they're special. I have no other words, but I really miss being in New York. It's been pretty tough 14 years trying to adjust, and I still just don't get there. So, you know, who we are as a people, the ability to be around each other and share things like Zoe says, the La Capurria and all the rest, that to me, we are so special. We are so different. And we're so much more loving than what I've been experiencing down here. So all of that,
I'm glad you
part of
bring
what,
that up, Nancy.
say again?
I'm glad you bring that up. The different experiences, and you know, there is a lot that we need to fight for. We're in a different place with less resources for people that look
Mm-hmm.
like us. So we're still in some senses fighting for a place at the table, but also creating our own tables, right? And I had a really interesting conversation with Raquel about this diaspora, right? So like we both want to be part of what's happening in Orlando. She's from Orlando. She, you know, considers herself an Orlando Rican. I still consider myself a New Yorican. And it's still a different diaspora, right? Than even like my experience and even Raquel's experience, who is from Orlando. So we had an interesting conversation at brunch, and I'm like, you know, we go into a place in Kissimmee and it's a whole different experience. It's not what I grew up with. So Raquel, you're on mute, but I don't know if you wanted to add to that really quickly since we were on that topic.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'll go next. So yeah, as I said, I was born in Far Rockaway, but I left when I was 3 years old to Puerto Rico, right? I moved to Moca. And so my early childhood memories are really like being in the campo, you know, like taking, you know, bananas out of the trees and like taking the little gandules out of their pods with my abuelita and running around the mountains. But then I also wasn't there for too long. I lived there for 2 years before moving to Orlando. So I came to Orlando when I was 5. I'm an Old Town shorty to the death. I say I'm New York Florican because while in Orlando I did have a very, I think, like New Yorican sort of experience, but I didn't realize how Florida I was until I actually moved back to New York, which is, I'll get into that in a bit. But yeah, no, I came here to East Orlando in 1995. So East Orlando was a very different place than it is right now. I mean, even folks at UCF. So even around UCF, a lot of that was just trees. Like Waterford was not a thing that existed. So it was really just Puerto Rican folk and some trees. Not a lot happening. But I'd say that my upbringing in East Orlando at the time was really quite unique from diaspora stories that I hear from other folks, and just the stories that we're more used to hearing from Boricuas. In the 90s and like early 2000s, I would say Orlando was really like this sancocho of New Yorkers, Island Ricans, and just being in the dirty South, right? Existing in the dirty South, right? And so that is like the merging, right, of these cultures that I think is like really special. The way I've described it in the past is like the South Bronx meets Aguadilla meets the South with an F. And I think when people like meet me or see me, they sort of see all those different parts of my identity. Because it's like what I've lived and breathed in Orlando for so long. But going back to like what Nancy has said, while Orlando, is one of the largest and fastest growing Puerto Rican populations in the country, there's really always been a resistance to our people here. When I was in grad school, I worked on this research paper that was sort of just looking at the Puerto Rican diaspora in Orlando. And so I was doing some research on city data to see what folks were saying about our people here. And some of the comments that I read were like, these folks are cockroaches. They are, it's like the West Side Story. They ruined New York and now they're ruining Orlando. They're not like the good Cubans in Miami. These are like N-words, Puerto Ricans. So like that just, I think, really speaks to this sort of, I guess the structures, right? I think that Nancy sort of spoke to, because it is really interesting because at once it's like, it feels like I am, or you are surrounded by Boricuas everywhere, right? You walk out your house and you hear salsa and reggaeton. You're driving in your car and every other car next to you has a bandera, right? It's like everywhere you go, Walmart, everyone's talking to you in Spanish. Like Puerto Rican accents are everywhere. So it feels like it's like, there's this presence, like we're home, this is ours, but yet there's always this underlying sort of like message or reminder that actually it's not, right? And so I think one thing that also just like comes to mind, so I actually I graduated, I got my bachelor's from UCF in 2012, but I remember being in the journalism program there, which I was in the journalism program and I also worked at the Nicholson School of Communication. So like, those are my folks over there. But at the time, like I was working 3 jobs and I was studying my ass off. And I remember someone telling me, a fellow student telling me, like, it's like, it doesn't matter like how hard you go and like how well you do, like you'll never be anything more than like this ghetto Puerto Rican girl. And that is, like that. So that idea is still like, it still very much exists, even when you feel like, even when you're sort of like represented, right, in all of these spaces, and it feels very like culturally home. And I think that for me and my work, I think these experiences and just all of these experiences, right, like going, like feeling that, right, from folks and from systems, but also just reveling in this culture that I know only exist here. This is not a story you've heard before. This is not any space you've ever, when you come to East Orlando, when you come to Kissimmee, you are in a space where you've never been to before. And it's, I think it's truly, you know, they say like Orlando is the most magical place on earth, right? Because of Disney World. But in reality, I think Boricuas and our diaspora is what really brings the magic to this city.
I agree.
And yeah, that's just like so important to me to sort of like highlight that, right, and show that. And it's really just inspires so much of my work. It's part of the reason why I moved back to Orlando after starting my career in New York, because I really want to show that, right, to the world. I think, Ja, it's time.
That's why it's important to highlight voices like yours, right? It's super accomplished and everyone has a different pathway, you know, and there's no right or wrong way to do this. And we all define our own success, right? So there's many more women that could be on here. The mom that works at Walmart and somehow, you know, still gets food on the table. I mean, hats off, right? So there's no one way to determine how success is accomplished, but I think it is important in many circles for people to hear voices and see faces like ours, and especially yours, because even though you've been through all these adversities, I mean, hey, you know, whether you've had it easy or not, it's not easy to hear that your people got cockroaches, right? It's not cool. And even if no one ever tells you that, if you have the kind of presence the way that Puerto Ricans have in Orlando, and you still don't have the power, or people don't look like you in positions of power, it's just as bad as calling me a cockroach. Okay, so whether someone says it explicitly or it's happening, right? And you know, Nancy's really modest because she hasn't talked about all of her activism and everything that she's done to move the needle on these things here in Orlando, but I hope she will before we end. But I do want to give Marisol an opportunity. I do want to give Marisol an opportunity to chime in here. But this is really powerful, right? Our experiences, you know, you are sort of the majority, right, among the Latino groups. Yet, you know, when I was registering voters, I had other ethnicities doing that work and saying, why don't your people vote? Why don't they want to vote? Like, what's the deal? A lot of people just don't know our history, right? And the colonial mentality. And that's a whole other webinar, and we should do it. But so Marisol, if you could chime in.
Well, I got to tell you, I thank you so much for this space, because even being able to name this with other Puertorriqueñas is brand new to me, right? So one of the things that I'm hearing and I want to pick up on is this theme of being ni de aquí ni de allá, right? Like traversing spaces and having experiences where you're really not from one place and not the other, or your Puerto Ricanness is questioned, or your identity is sort of challenged. I grew up in the 70s and 80s and in New York City, like I said, in Spanish Harlem and the housing projects. And so my upbringing not only was deeply influenced by being Puertorriqueña, and that was definitely celebrated in my family, but it was also extremely influenced by what was happening in the world at that time, which was the AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic. There was just a lot of pain and poverty going on. And I can't think about my childhood without thinking about how all those things, the hip hop, the emergence of rap music. I mean, I remember when it was birthed, right? And all those things deeply shaped me. You know, obviously growing up in Spanish Harlem, I grew up with, yes, a lot of Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, but African Americans. And I can never sort of extract the influence on me with that. But when I think about it, it was a time where there was a lot of complexities. I loved hearing the salsa music blasting from our radios, from the taxis going by, the hip hop music. There was a lot of challenges going on, and being the youngest in a family of 8, I was really, I felt the pressure and the desire to help my family, like so many of us do, right? That's many times we leave to try to come back and help our families. And so I remember going, dealing with this ni de aquí ni de allá issue from the very beginning, because as the Mexicans here will tell me in Arizona, soy bien güerita, I'm real blanquita, right? Con pelo rubio, which was natural back then, no longer, you know, L'Oreal helped me out now, pero I was this little white girl living in Harlem who every day had to walk outside and hope she didn't get into a fist fight just because of the color of her skin, right? And being questioned of whether I was Latina enough, even though I had mad cultural pride and all those things. I think I also had some ambivalence, to be really honest, about being Puerto Rican, not because I wasn't infused with the pride, but I was also seeing the way we were treated in society, right? I was also very attuned to the racism, even as a little girl. The name of my first book is Puerto Rican Goldilocks, and that's literally based on the favor and the experience of privilege that I had in an underprivileged environment simply because of the color of my skin and the color of my hair. And I have a twin sister who has curly hair and more olive skin. He looks more Puerto Rican, whatever that means. And I remember having opportunities extended to me and kindness extended to me in school because I knew then at 5 and 6 years old, because I look a little bit more like my teachers, right? I look more like their kids. And so all those things really impacted me. And when I went to college is when it really came to a head, because up until that point, even though I grew up in El Barrio, I never once had a Spanish or Black teacher. I never had a minority teacher in my whole first K through 12 experience. And I'll never forget walking into the small private school in upstate New York, Marist College, walking into my first class in freshman year in Spanish and seeing a Puerto Rican professor, Irma Blanco Casey. Now, this is 30 years ago, standing on the desk, literally physically standing on the desk, giving a speech on why Puerto Rico should be independent. And it blew my mind. And she introduced me to Tato Laviera and all this literature and all this stuff that I had never been exposed to, having grown up in El Barrio. And so that was really empowering. And at the same time, my freshman year, minority students on our campus had to march against the Ku Klux Klan. There was a highly racialized case called the Tawana Brawley case in upstate New York. And Nancy, I see you nodding your head. You remember that probably.
Oh, very well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, my school was in Poughkeepsie, in the neighboring town. And freshman year, I found myself marching against the Ku Klux Klan with other minority students. So on one hand, there was like this infusion of cultural pride as I, learned more and more about my history beyond what my family had taught me. But at the same time, this recognition that I was, again, still an outsider and that I would always have to be working, sort of swimming uphill, if you will. And so in terms of how it informed and shaped me, I've been an educator for 25 years. And everything that I do really, from the time I was a student trying to be an advocate for other students to my career, has been about how do we make it right? How do we make it welcoming? How do we make it fair for Latino students and minority students and Puerto Rican students? And this feeling of ni de aquí ni de allá has been almost like a life theme, right? But it's one that I have stopped fighting. And it's one that I actually embrace, particularly having lived in Arizona for 25 years. I mean, if you think it's rough in places like Florida, imagine yourself. I mean, the last statistic I read, there's something like 20,000 Puerto Ricans in the state of Arizona. And Arizona is a really big place. So yes, we all have a bandera in the car, but having to navigate identity among other Latino groups, and in a place where they don't really understand what a Puerto Rican is. I mean, up until very recently, you didn't even see, a lot of cultural expression and stuff from our community. So, but I really appreciate all the themes you guys have named, and I definitely resonate with them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have so much to talk about, but I do want to make sure, since we have about 30 minutes left, I want to make sure that you tell us about your recent published books. So I want to start with Elizabeth. Like I said, shamelessly plug, please provide the links so that we can go out and support. There you go. Raquel has it. I need to make sure I get a copy myself. Just, I know that all of your work, precisely why you're here, is connected to your identity in some way, right? Or your passion, for making sure that this doesn't get lost, this history, this identity. So if we can start off with Elizabeth, please tell us about your most recent book, and just tell us all about it.
No, I just want to say that I really appreciate this conversation. I just feel like, oh my God, I'm like, it's 30 minutes. And I just feel like there's so much that like there is to talk about. Like I'm listening to Maricel and Nancy and Raquel, and I'm like, oh my God, there's like, there are like thousands of books just within all of us, right? Everybody here in this panel, we have so much to talk about and so much to write about. And I'm just looking at this time like, Diablo, 30 minutes, that's okay. What are we what do we touch on that's like, you know, the most important, when in reality, everything is the most important. And I think that that was very much a theme for me in my life, was like, what parts of me do I showcase, right? In order to survive. And what parts of me do I have to compartmentalize? Not necessarily hide from me, because there really was no hiding when you allow Puerto Rican from the Bronx, from Brooklyn. I worked in the Bronx for like 11 years, so that's like my other home. But you know, that was very much a theme, right? It's like you are told, kind of like what Maricel was saying and what Raquel was saying. When I was doing research on my book, I wrote let me do the shameless plug, espérate. When we make it.
Do it.
I found out in the 1950s, there was an entire op-ed that was happening weekly called The Puerto Rican Problem in the Daily News, which is a newspaper in New York. The Puerto Rican Problem, that was like somebody ran that through their editorial team, right? Like the process that you have to go through to like get a headline approved, right? And somebody say, yeah, you know, that sounds great. That's the Puerto Rican problem. Let's just do that, right? So automatically,
I did not know this. Wow.
Yeah, I'll send it to you, Raquel. Automatically.
What year was this? What year was this?
I want to say, don't quote me, but I want to say 1953 or 1955. I'll send it in the email.
I was the problem.
Right. And it was talking about the migration of Puerto Ricans to New York. And the whole premise of the op-eds did get to examine like why Puerto Ricans were living in such a underclass. I was one of those, right? My mother was, well, I wasn't born yet, but my mother was one of those. And just looking at Puerto Ricans from a very, you know, voyeuristic standpoint, like, oh my God, like, look at those people. And so, you know, Puerto Ricans have been dehumanized from the very, 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 I mean, Puerto Ricans on the island, and then when they came here, right? So it's like, it is not new, whether you are diasporican or you were born on the island, you have had some level of your humanity stripped from you, and have had to like work towards letting people know, like, don't play with me, you know what I mean? On various levels, like, don't play with me on various levels, right? Intellectually, in la cocina, you know, and everywhere, right? And so that's part of the reason why A, I became a writer, and B, I wrote this book because I was one of the diasporicans that came into my history very, very late, very, very late. I had a baby when I got pregnant when I was 15. I had a baby when I was 16. My counselor automatically brought me into the high school and was like, sorry, you're a bad example, right? The Puerto Rican problem, you know, permeating in our school systems. And, you know, I got shuffled out to a very understaffed, under-resourced school for pregnant girls, which thank God doesn't exist in New York anymore. But that was a thing. And it was a whole bunch of other Puerto Rican and Black girls who were looked at as the issue, right? As somebody, that's it. We're just gonna put you over here. We're not gonna give you any resources or tools to survive, but you gotta figure it out in some way, shape, or form. And so I spent a lot of my life figuring it out, just like my mother has spent a lot of her life figuring it out, just like her mother has spent a lot of her life figuring it out. And so survival was and is and continues to be a huge part of Puerto Rican identity. You know, I really started to ask myself, well, who am I outside of survival? What happens if I just wake up every day and decide to live? And, you know, how do I do that without having to prove my humanity? And so as somebody who dropped out of high school, who had to, you know, wake up at 3 in.the morning to get on a train, to get sexually harassed by the weirdos on the train at 4 a.m, to, you know, at 16 years old, to go feed my daughter, who was then taken from me because I was too young and had a whole bunch of stuff going on, right? So now my daughter's removed from my custody. There was no time for Puerto Rican history. I was living Puerto Rican history, right? I was the Puerto Rican history, but you know, that isn't talked about, right? And so I very much wanted to write this book to talk about you know, I think that in a lot of, I've been around a lot of academic circles, and I love my academics. I love y'all, you know, and also I think that, you know, I think about myself when I was 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I didn't get my GED till I was 21. And I was still just trying, I was a Puerto Rican just trying to make it, just trying to live, right? And I didn't have access to these libraries because a lot of our history is really, if you ain't got $2.50 to get on the train to go to El Centro in the city, to go to the Schomburg, te jodiste, because then you stuck with the local library who has like maybe one book, right? And so I really wanted to kind of talk about that side of it too, talk about the ways in which we exist outside of the buzzwords. Like, this is what it looks like. This is what this side looks like. And I'm glad that there are so many stories. Like I said, we have like 50,000 books just between the 5 of us, because we have to have these conversations. We have to talk about it, because my Puerto Rican experience is different than Nancy's, is different than Raquel, is different than Zoe's, and it doesn't cross each other out, you know. And we're talking about that ni de aquí de allá. And I want to end, because I've been at 20 minutes and I'm clocking the time, with a quote that Nicolás Amor, who is another phenomenal Puerto Rican writer who I did not come across till I was an adult. She was asked in an interview, you know, is there a conflict between being born in New York and being a writer writing about Puerto Rican experience? And she said, there is no conflict. I was born as a Puerto Rican. I didn't invent it. It is my culture. You know, there have always been Puerto Ricans in the States, Puerto Rican identities in the States. At that time, she did the interview in 1993. She said, Puerto Ricans in the States have been around here in the United States for almost a century. Now it's more than now. Being Puerto Rican is not circumscribed by being necessarily born on the island. But she also did say, I don't write about being Puerto Rican on the island. I write about being Puerto Rican in New York. So I think it's important to contextualize that and really be honest about the type of Puerto Rican experience that we are talking about, and being specific is a big part of that.
Thank you. I think I heard a reading that you did on Instagram, and it was about, you know, this concept of making it, you know. And I think to some extent we probably all made it in some way, shape, or form, but that we're not fully accepted, right? So like, look at the, you know, Puerto Rican, we have US citizenship. Hello, right? So why are we asked where we're from? You know, even when we say, even if we said Americana, I'm American. Well, where are you really from, right? So this concept of making it, that you're supposed to kind of abandon, using your words, Elizabeth, you know, who you are, you know, when you've made it. But then you're slapped with the reality that if you look a certain way and talk a certain way, unless you shed that identity, and even then, right? And even with US citizenship, that's the thing, right? That's the most interesting part of all of this, right? That you're never really fully accepted. And there's always that conversation. And so this notion that if you work hard enough and you pull yourself up by the bootstrap, you know, you're going to be respected and you're going to be seen as a human, right? And not part of a Puerto Rican problem, is a myth. Is a myth, and it just doesn't work for many folks. So anyway, I'll stop there. But if perhaps Nancy, if you can tell us a little bit about your book and why you decided to write about Hurricane Maria.
Well, I would love to hold up a copy of it, but my boss walked in here, saw my name on the book and walked away with it. Well, that's the nature of where I'm at.
We're gonna provide the link. Karen's helping.
It's all good. It's the name of the book is Tossed by the Wind. And in Orlando, when we saw after Hurricane Maria, the number of people that were moving to Orlando and the type of assistance that we're trying to give them, and how messy that whole situation became, we wanted to capture as early as possible.
I found this on the web.
Oh, look at that! My phone, even my watch wants to talk. We wanted to be able to document it because in Orlando we were not going to find this kind of history documented in the general history. They have a history center there and so on and so forth. So it was important to us, myself and Maria Padilla, who's at one time was the editor of the Sentinel. It's probably the most read paper in Orlando. Um, and as I said before, my interest has always been in photography. So I went to Puerto Rico 1 month after the storm, collected those pictures, came back, and then collected images, video, and did interviews of these people while it was still fresh, while the trauma was still going on. Like I said, I'm a clinical social worker. So part of it was identifying who I could help in the clinical sense. So I started a program right there at UCF. UCF has a wonderful trauma treatment program. So we were able to provide that while they gifted us something very precious. They gifted us their stories. And we had this experience of hearing them, watching them desahogarse, which to us is very important. We are storytellers. We're storytellers. No, even in Chisme, we're storytellers. So it was the opportunity given that we could give them to descargarse with us, if possible, add the extra help, but collect the stories and put them in a book. Um, uh, Florida University was gracious enough to reach out and ask us to do this, but we were already doing it because we couldn't let these stories become old. We tend to embellish or shift things, or our memory becomes foggy about some issues. Anybody who's been through a trauma knows what I'm talking about. And we wanted to catch it there, catch it raw. And I think we have a responsibility. Those of us who are inclined to writing or inclined to documenting visually, we have a responsibility to archive this, to have our stories at the ready. Um, and we have to put aside what everybody else is saying about us and to us, and are you going to make it, you didn't make it, you kind of made it. You got to put all that aside and just move forward with what you have to do for your people. I'm a minority within a minority. I'm part of the LGBTQ community, and I'm Latina. So when I was in New York, I fought very hard for LGBTQ rights. But when I got to Florida and I realized that that community was doing just fine. Um, but with the Pulse shooting, Zoe and I worked with that community, and we realized that the people who were jumping on the bandwagon and getting funded and so on and so forth were not us. We're not the most affected group. The highest number of people that were killed, were Latinos, and of that, I think it was like 16 of them. I forget what the numbers are. It's been more than 5 years, and I'm old. But the bulk of them were Puerto Rican, and yet the funding didn't come to us. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and all of this also needs to be documented, which I know is going to get me into a pack of trouble, but that's okay. Um, all of this needs to be, because it's proof, right? It's evidence of what our history has been like and what it still is. So I think all of us, I mean, I've loved hearing your voices. I thank you all for sharing. In a minute, my boss is going to come here and drag me out. But my point is just that we have this obligation to future generations to let them know that A, you can make it. B, it's still going on. It's maybe not what my parents encountered when they first came here, which I think was awfully brave. For those of you who had parents who came and didn't speak the language and so on, so I think that is so incredibly brave. But dealing with the folks from Hurricane Maria, one of the things that really stood out, and I want to make this point, was that I would hear things from the people, quote, helping, unquote, that, well, now that they're on the mainland, espérate, my mainland is over there. This is your mainland. But they want to sell us on the concept that this is our mainland too. But no, no así. That's our mainland. And when we come here, we have to welcome each other extravagantly. I don't care what kind of a mess they are, or if they came in, then they brought the Rolls Royce with them. We have to document. We have to stand with each other. We have to get this across, and it's the verbiage, and it's the passion, and it's our commitment to our community that's going to make a difference later on to our kids.
Thank you, Nancy. And I think I heard you
And yeah, I
say,
got off the soapbox, Zoe. I got it.
no, 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 this is so incredibly important. And thank you for documenting that. And, 5 years later, it's been 4 years since
4
Maria.
years.
4 years later, Puerto Rico still suffers, I mean, tremendously, and it's inhumane, right? Um, and to think that we have citizenship, and there's been plenty of examples of how we can see we've been treated as second-class citizens, but I think Hurricane Maria opened up people's eyes that we're apolitical, that we're complacent, that didn't mind, having the relationship that we have with the United States. Ahí fue que abrieron los ojos, espérate. We don't have light and water for months. Like, what is this, right? And it's, mismanagement on the island, and we have a whole lot of reasons why that was. But I think that opened up a lot of eyes. And reinvigorated people to become more active, right? And that's when we saw the Ricky Renuncia movement. And for me, I mean, I was literally at work at UCF, as a matter of fact, little to nobody really cared about what was happening in Puerto Rico around me. Y yo estaba llorando como una pendanga. I was crying at my desk because of the emotions of seeing un pueblo to finally rise. Enough is enough. Mm-hmm. And Hurricane Maria was part of it. It was also domestic violence and homicides, due to, so the feminist movement really ignited a lot of that work too, and that activism. So it's a really defining moment in Puerto Rico's history. And a lot of it has to do with how our government and government on the island failed to respond to that, one of the worst natural disasters in modern history, really, right? So I think, 4 years later, if you weren't directly impacted, if you're part of the diaspora and have never lived in Puerto Rico, we may forget, honestly, and we may actually be desensitized to a lot of things that are happening. I'm glad to see that through, Instagram, and I'm going to stop Nancy's video because she said, thank you so much, Nancy, for your participation.
I apologize, but this is like my 4th day on the job. And so when they say jump,
even
I jump.
when you're retired.
At least for now. But a little while, me pongo loquita, and they'll have to deal with me.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. All right. Well, so I mean, all that to say that there's just so much work to be done, and to some extent, yes, like Hurricane Maria shed light on a lot of issues and unresolved things around our status, right? The island status and relationship with Puerto Rico. But the fact that we are citizens and that we are treated so inhumanely, and that still today we have such poor infrastructure on the island is just astonishing to me. So I think that's probably another webinar. So I'm going to get back to having you all talk about your books and your work. But I wanted to recognize, that Hurricane Maria and the aftermath of that we're still feeling it, and that it has tremendously impacted this community, and led to a lot of out-migration, as you all know, and really into Central Florida. So, which is part of the reason why the Puerto Rico Research Hub exists, and that there's so much work to be done in terms of research and services, but also highlighting our strengths, right? And that's part of why we wanted to celebrate, our identity and also you all. So I'll stop there. So Maricel, can you tell me more about I'm not sure if you published more than one piece of work. It's been 2. So if you can tell us about your work and how your experiences as a Boricua has shaped those.
Sure. And I just wanted to add on, it excites me to hear about all the activism and the support that sort of emerged, hopefully, out of Hurricane Maria, and obviously beyond that, and before that. It reminded me that in Arizona, I was at Arizona State University when Hurricane Maria happened, and talk about being survivors, right? Luchadoras. There was a Puerto Rican professor who had just recently visited Arizona State in the field of STEM. And when this happened on the island, she contacted the president of ASU, and she personally managed to get 10 students full rides at ASU during Hurricane Maria who were graduate students. And so I remember that because they found the one Puerto Rican everybody knew, me, at the university, because I had been there for so long, and they literally said, "Te encargo este estudiante." We hand you these 10 students, all, like I said, grad students or about to graduate. And it was such a powerful experience to walk alongside them. to hear their stories, to support them, and to see their incredible just tenacity, but also guilt, right? That they got out and that they had to leave their families in the midst of all that trauma and lack in order to pursue this degree. So it was just really powerful this far out west to see Puerto Ricans come together, and this one Puerto Rican professor from University of Puerto Rico managed to get 10 students this opportunity so they could finish their programs. And all of them had plans of going back so that they can contribute back to the community. My first book was Puerto Rican Goldilocks, shameless plug. And then I wrote a book in 2015 called Lean Into Grace. They're both self-published. I went that route because me dio la gana and I'm impatient. So that's what I did. And it's really kind of funny because Puerto Rican Goldilocks, I actually wrote in graduate school. And I wrote it it wasn't intended as a book when I started writing it. It was a journal. When I moved out here to Arizona back in 1995, it was extremely aggressive and racialized climate in Arizona. This was the year of the O.J. Simpson trial, so just for context. And I really felt like I was having this mad, not only culture shock, but having a really hard time with the messages that I felt that graduate school demanded of me, of who I was and what I had come from in my community in New York. And so my writing Puerto Rican Goldilocks initially was a journal trying to reconcile, if you will, these two sets of rules, back to the ni de aquí ni de allá. I felt like graduate school wanted me to subjugate everything that I was, all the wisdom and knowledge that I had as a Puerto Rican growing up in New York, and to privilege, academic knowledge. And it was a really psychologically difficult and painful experience. And so that's why I wrote Puerto Rican Goldilocks, which is a collection of poems and short stories, recuerdos of my mother, of my community. And I was trying to hold on to my identity, even as it evolved in this other, part of us. And I think that's one of the things that I've sort of heard in this conversation today is this need to create a more expansive definition for ourselves as what it means to be Puerto Rican, right? You can be Puerto Rican and not speak Spanish. You can be Puerto Rican and live in the Southwest. You can be Puerto Rican and go to college or not go to college. There's just this need to have more expansive definitions of that. And so I was fortunate, again, in my first semester of graduate school to meet, again, the only Puerto Rican professor. Somebody told her, I guess when we show up places, we make so much noise that we get attention. And somebody told her, mira, hay una puertorriqueña que se quiere ir. I didn't feel like I fit in. And she walked up to me, Doctora Ursula Casanova, and she took me to lunch, and that was that. And she became my second mom. And she was an example for me of sort of the having it all. He was a Puerto Rican woman. She had actually been married to the son of the governor of Puerto Rico back in the day. Deeply Puerto Rican, deeply activist, had gotten her PhD in her 50s, was a grandmother, una mamá, sabía cocinar. She knew all the Puerto Rican things, and she was the scholar. And she gave me an example of you could be a lot of different things and still be truly, deeply, authentically Puerto Rican. And so I'm really thankful for mentors who were at the right time when I needed them, showing me that I could be whole, even though I was a first generation student and, traversing new experiences. So Puerto Rican Goldilocks was my lifeline. It was my journal. And as I started sharing it, I realized that not only did it resonate with other Puerto Ricans, it resonated with a whole bunch of other people who were not Latino, or who had immigrant stories. I'll never forget the Navajo man who walked up to me, 90 years old, and said, "You just told my story from the reservation in Arizona." And I'm like, I'm a Puerto Rican from Harlem, but the universal themes connected us. And so that's what the Puerto Rican Goldilocks is about. And then, like I said, later on, I became a life coach and melded, I also have a degree in social work, melded coaching and education and higher education. And so the second book I wrote is called Lean Into Grace. And it was a response to, in part, the book Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, which was a big hit. And it was basically promoting be more like a white man in order to be successful. And I was really frustrated by that. That was my sense of the book. And there were a lot of women rallying around it. And I just felt like I had to hard look at my life. And while, yes, I had opportunity and education and mentors at that season of my life, I really wanted to capture the fact that even with all of those things, I would not be where I am in my life without God. And so it's called Lean into Grace. And it sort of is a women's coaching playbook, and it's my professional story, but it's also the place of faith. Because I don't know if anybody else experienced this, but I have often felt that to be a professional or to be an academic circles, you have to cut off the spiritual part of who you are. And that's so core to who we are as Puerto Ricans. So the second book is around that.
Thank you for that. There's, again, so many, like as Elizabeth was saying, so many topics to cover here, you know. I thought about writing a book myself. I've been through so much, you know, I identify a lot with your upbringing, Marisol. I also grew up in a very Puerto Rican and Black neighborhood. And so I had really strong, you know, Black teachers, you know, and, you know, we were taught, you know, to be resilient in so many different ways by these different influences. But at some point you get tired, and we should be allowed to grieve and to, you know, hurt. And I think that this notion that if you come from a tough neighborhood or you come from a minoritized community, that somehow you're more resilient, or that you should be, it really, it hurts our community, right? As does machismo, right? You don't cry if you're, you know, a boy, you know, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of work to be done. And so I, you know, I bring a lot of grit to what I do, right? I do lean in, pero coño, at some point you want to be able to do some self-care, right? And, you know, and to your, you know, your point about faith, right? And grace. And, you know, so when do we stop being the tough Puerto Rican that can get things done because you've been in survival mode your whole life? ¿Entiende? And I think you can only stop being that when systems change, and when we are accepted and respected, and, you know, power is reflective of our diversity and what we look like in this country, right? So I'll stop there, but there's so much more that could be said, and you know, it's just that grit, you know, telling our kids that they can make it, and they can make it, and they have to keep fighting. Well, when do we get to stop fighting? And that's really in the hands of other people and systems, and not only ours, right? So Raquel, my love, tell me, you're an accomplished journalist. You keeps it real, and I love that. And I'd love for you to really talk about your work and what you publish, what kind of articles, what kind of blogs you have. Like, tell us more about your work.
Yeah, so I'm not a published author yet.
Yes.
Emphasis on the yet. I am working on, you know, writing a young adult novel at the moment that is inspired by my upbringing in, you know, a hood in Goldenrod, East Orlando, okay. And really just growing up within a space where it's, you know, where the swamps meets the suburbs, meets the tropics, meets, you know, or an urban, larger cities. So I'm really, really, really excited about that. But journalistically, my work has for so long, as a writer and reporter, has so long like centered mostly Puerto Rican women's stories. So I'm often in Puerto Rico. And I mean, especially, you know, after Maria, I was there about 2 weeks after the storm hit, and I was there with a team doing some independent journalism work, working with mothers, highlighting the stories of mothers, you know, just trying to get by, right, in such a difficult time. But even since then, right, so I've done some reporting on the state of like abortion rights, right, or abortion access after Maria, right, and all the unplanned pregnancies that we saw after Maria that folks weren't talking about, and you know, women and non-binary folks just not being able, trans folks not being able to access you know, the abortion care that they needed. And so what does that mean, right? I mean, more recently, last year I did a bigger piece around gender violence in Puerto Rico, which was probably one of the hardest pieces I've ever had to write. I'll be honest, a lot of my work does focus on body politics, so I'm very used to writing about reproductive justice and gender violence and eating disorders and just thinking about the body politically. But I spent a lot of time just speaking with so many different women for that story. And one, listening to stories of violence and abuse personally felt, or from like the siblings of women who were murdered, and it's just confronting sort of that the state failures that still continue to exist today, despite so many calls for change, right? So that is, I mean, I can go on and on and on. To be very honest, I feel like I've covered most angles when it comes to body politics and Puerto Rican women. But beyond my work journalistically, I've also done, you know, as you know, Zoe, I've created, when I came back to Orlando, I've been back in Orlando about, I think like 4 years now. Yeah, going on 4 years now. And one of the reasons why I came back is because when I moved to New York after you know, college, well, again, I realized there that I wasn't as Nuyorican as I thought I was, right? So growing up in Orlando, I was always Raquel, the Nuyorican girl. And then when I moved to New York, they were like, oh, you got a little Southern twang to you. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. So then I realized how floaty body I was. And also just seeing like the access, right? So it's so interesting because everything that, like, you know, Elizabeth and Nancy and Maricel are saying, and even to you, Zoe, are saying are so true, right? We don't have access, right, to so much unless we are in these academic spaces. But even still, I saw how young people had just this sort of like, you know, maybe you know who the young lords are, you know, or you heard something in passing, or like there's spaces for poetry, for Nuyorican poetry to exist, and that those spaces did not exist for me at all in Orlando, at all. It was just not a thing. Puerto Rican pride, obviously, you can't leave your house and not be proud to be Puerto Rican because it's literally all around you. But those like educational and art spaces were not a thing. And so seeing that, I was jealous, like straight up, I was jealous. I was like, I want that. I needed that as a kid. And so I always knew that I wanted to return to Orlando and do what I can to sort of create those spaces here. And so about 2 years ago, I started an Instagram page called Puerto Ricans of Orlando, which the goal of that page was really to just like highlight dope folks who are either here or grew up here and are elsewhere and who are just doing really dope work. The point of that was really to sort of create some sort of like cultural pride in being an Orlando Rican. And keep our folks here, right? And also just share our history, because a lot of times when we talk about the Puerto Rican diaspora in Orlando, it stops at, or it's as if it starts at Hurricane Maria, and we didn't exist here before. And so I really want to also definitely push back on that narrative. So yeah, that I will be expanding on next year with a new name and so many new projects, including in-person projects. So I'm really, really thrilled about what's to come. But even more recently, I also started a mentorship program called Escribe Mi Gente, which basically is it's a mentorship program for Puerto Rican cultural critics, emerging Puerto Rican cultural critics. Boricuas, as we know, we are like a powerhouse in terms of creating culture, right? From music to film to dance to everything. Like, we are a global powerhouse. Considering how tiny we are, our impact is truly worldwide. It's massive. yet we are not the folks who are writing about our own our own stories, right? Our own culture, our cultural producers, what's happening on the island, what's happening in our communities, right? It's often not us who are tasked to write those stories. And so the point of Escribe Mi Gente is to merge, or to connect young emerging writers who want to do that work with established cultural critics, who mentor them for a month, and then at the end they produce an essay that will be published in a journal that I'm excited to print at the end of the year. So a lot.
No, that's great. And congratulations on all of your work.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to that book, but without that book, you're amazing. So
Thank you.
por favor. So I think that's a really good segue to kind of celebrate what we're most proud of. And so maybe we can end that way. Raquel, I don't know if you got to cover that, but Maricela, I would ask you, what work are you most proud of that has to do with your identity? Besides your books, maybe. Yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Oh, wow, that's a good one. What work? Do you literally mean like a contribution, or is it?
Contribution. I say work, but my life is work, which is not healthy. So maybe I'm using it differently, but anything that you're most proud of that has to do with your identity.
Yeah, my first gut answer to that was going to be my son. I know he's my world. I recognize he's not everybody's world. But I think the reason I would say that, and that links to my bigger answer, is the impact that I have had on so many youth and students of color and women of color throughout my career. Whether that was working at the university, whether that's through consulting or writing. I also do poetry. I've literally been privileged to walk alongside, coach, and support thousands and thousands of students throughout my career. And overwhelmingly, those have been minority students, and overwhelmingly, that have been Latinas. And I know that that's what I was put on this earth to do. And so it's the most fulfilling work that I've ever done. And I think it's the most impactful work that I will continue to do. When I say my son, I think what I'm proud of is that I raised a young man who is Boricua Moreno, African-American and Puerto Rican, in Arizona, where there's very few of either, with a really, really strong sense of what it means to be a Black Puerto Rican man, maintained his identity, his culture. And it's just, I know us Puerto Rican women, we love our boys, right? Pero he's my only child, and I thank God I got it right. And I've been blessed with that, just because the kind of young man he is, who has a consciousness about women, about treating women well, about honoring them. He has a sense of his Puerto Rican heritage. He sends me pictures of him. He's living in St. Paul now. He's graduated college. Sends me pictures of him cooking. Asks me how to make, pernil. Shows me his café bustelo. He holds on and actively pursues the things that would not necessarily surrounding him, having grown up, not heavily around both those cultures. And I also think I think that men in general don't get a lot of love, a lot of attention, a lot of support services and the like, much less minority men. And he just makes me really proud about the human being he is, and the minority male that he is, and the complexity of who he is, but also the tenderness, right, against all those stereotypes that are fed to our men. So I would say, and as an individual him, but really it's been, people tell me all the time, oh my God, you've impacted so many people, you're a role model, you're this or that. And that's blessing, and that's beautiful. And those recognitions are nice. But I literally stumbled into my calling very early in life. And I'm so thankful for that, because I feel like I've been able to get up most days of my life and do what I'm supposed to do, which is to help uplift others, right? And to do it in mass scale. It's just a passionate that I think, if I go out doing that, I'll have gone and fulfilled my purpose. So those are what I'm most proud of.
Thank you. I thank you for the reminder that work is not everything. And raising young men and women who are proud of who they are and have a strong sense of identity is really important. I've worked with children in the past, and that foundation is so important. There's been research in the past that the stronger you feel a sense of identity, I think you know what I mean, the more likely you are to succeed, right? And for so many of our young people, they're really struggling with that identity, with multiple identities and the intersectionalities of those, right? Whether your skin is fair or dark, your sexuality or your gender identity, like all of these things, right? And we don't talk about it early enough, and if it's not happening at home, like my mom just wanted me to graduate from high school without getting pregnant, frankly. And to have done that, that was what she was measuring as success in that household, in that neighborhood at the time. So there was no talk about college, there was very little guidance. And we definitely didn't talk about, the fact that I was a brown skin, girl growing up in this community, that I'm Puerto Rican, that I'm different. And it didn't happen until I got to college that I took a class. Well, first of all, the shock, right? I go to this predominantly white school in Harlem, by the way, pero that's not who was within those walls, right? And so I go to this predominantly white school, and I have the long curly hair, the bamboo earrings, the red nails, the red lipstick. Like there was no question that
Around the way girl.
I was definitely a around the way girl, right? And I still am. So I'm just like, okay, all right. So if I don't come to class, they're gonna notice. Okay, so tengo que tener cuidado. I was accused of plagiarism because I can write better than I can speak. It is what it is. We're bilingual, obviously something to be proud of, but sometimes, that messes with how fast you can learn to speak as a child and all these things. But anyway, so I think that we don't really get to explore these concepts until much later on, because it's not embedded in our curricula, right? So, middle school, high school, like no one's talking about race, gender, and class. And it's only if you end up in college, or you attend one of the leadership programs in the community that's probably poorly funded, right, that you really start to analyze these things and really become comfortable with these concepts. So if it's not happening at home, where do you get that, right? So that's another topic, obviously. But raising children, that are proud of who they are and have a strong sense of self, whatever self that is very critical. And some people have the ability, like we are privileged, to know that that's important and to be able to instill that in others, and some don't, right? And so that speaks to the need for people like us and the university and all these other entities and sectors to have programs like that and opportunities for those explorations.